Get ready to spice up your life with this homemade Sriracha sauce recipe. In this video, I'll show you how to make your own fermented hot sauce that's so good it'll have your taste buds dancing and your friends asking for the recipe. Trust me, it's so good you'll be putting it on everything from eggs to ice cream. So grab your chili peppers and let's get adventurous. You can use pretty much any type of chili for this recipe, but obviously the hotter the chili and the more that you add, the hotter the sauce. I've got a Scotch bonnet chili plant in my backyard which has been very productive this year, so I'm using those. But normally this would be made with something a bit milder like red jalapenos, serranos, or red Thai chilies. The other main ingredients are a large red capsicum and a head of garlic. The recipe that I'm showing you today should be enough to make around 500 to 600 ml of sauce. You don't have to ferment this sauce, but I'd recommend that you do. It gives it a really nice tang and brings out a whole lot of wonderful complex flavors. If you've never fermented anything before, this recipe is a great place to start. I'll start by peeling a whole head of garlic. Some of these cloves have some brown spots, so I'm just removing those with a knife and throwing them away. Next, onto the capsicum. You want a really nice ripe red pepper for this. That way you'll get maximum flavor and sweetness and the sauce will be a really vibrant red. I like to start with my knife at the top of the capsicum and slice downwards to remove each cheek while leaving the pith and the seeds in place. That way you're left with all the pith and seed in one big lump, which makes for easy cleanup. And I'm not going to trim these pieces down too much just yet. I want at least one piece that's big and wide enough to fit snugly in the fermentation jar and hold all of the other ingredients in place. Then before I handle any chilies, I'm putting on some gloves. You don't have to do this, but it's highly recommended, especially if, like me, you're using chilies that are really quite hot. And always remember the golden rule: if you're cooking with chili, don't touch your sensitive areas like your eyes and stuff. This recipe is super flexible, so don't get too stressed about the quantities. This will end up being around 1.5 cups of chopped chilies once I'm finished, and this sauce is going to be seriously hot. Using a milder chili like a jalapeno would result in a heat level closer to store-bought Sriracha. I don't need to cut things up too finely at this stage. I'm just cutting each of the Scotch bonnets in half so that the inside and out will be covered by the brine while they're fermenting. And because these Scotch bonnets are hotter than the chilies that you'd normally use to make Sriracha, I'm choosing to remove the seeds and the membranes, because this is where most of the heat is. If you're using milder chilies and you don't mind the texture of seeds in your final sauce, then you might choose to leave these in. So I'll keep going until all of these chilies are chopped in half, and then I'll put those aside. And fun fact, I took the gloves off to change camera angles, and when I put them on, I put them back on inside out, which wasn't good. Ooh, uh-oh. What have I done? Oh no. Whew, okay, now that things have had a chance to settle down again, I'm putting my garlic into a large jar ready for fermentation, followed by the chilies, followed by the capsicum, with the largest piece of capsicum sitting on top to hold everything in place. And then I'm firmly pressing those down into the jar to make sure there's ample space for the brine. You want your fermentation to be around 3 to 6% salt by weight. To achieve that, I've made a brine that's a little bit stronger, about 4% salt by weight, in order to account for the extra water in the vegetables. Since filming, I've learned a much more accurate way of doing this, and I would recommend following that method, which is to place your jar on a set of scales, tear the jar weight so you're back to zero, add your chilies to the jar, fill the jar with water, and then calculate your salt percentage based on the total weight of the chilies and the water that fits in the jar. For example, if your jar holds 300 grams of chilies and 200 grams of water, that's 500 grams total, times that by 0.03 to get 3%, and that equals 15 grams of salt to get a 3% solution. Throw the salt in the jar, whack a lid on, give it a shake until it's all dissolved, then remove the lid and put some kind of a weight on top to make sure that everything is submerged under the salty water. For the fermentation, you're going to want to use filtered or bottled water. Any residual chlorine from tap water will stop the fermentation, and you'll also need to use some pure sea salt, not iodized salt or table salt, as these have a few additives that may hinder the fermentation process. I like to put the whole thing on a plate while it ferments, because sometimes things expand as bubbles get created, and this helps to catch any drips or overflow. And then we play the waiting game. The length of time to ferment this can be variable and can also be adjusted based based on your preferences. For me, at about 3% salt, with a room temperature of about 22 degrees Celsius, mine was tasting and smelling quite good after about a week. Do remember to check the fermentation every day. The main things to look for are any signs of spoilage such as mold, but really as long as everything stays submerged underneath the brine, you shouldn't have any issues. The fermentation should smell clean and have an aroma of chilies, garlic and salt. If you can see a little bit of white haze in the water, it's likely yeast and nothing to be worried about. If your brine level gets low due to evaporation, just add some more filtered water. The concentration of salt in the solution should remain the same. So this is what mine looked like after a week of fermentation. There's been lots of active bubbling during this time, and the weight has pushed the chilies down further as they've softened from the fermentation. When it comes time to make your sauce, remove the weight and drain off the liquid, making sure you set it aside for later. Then throw everything into a blender or food processor, along with 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, and a generous splash of the fermenting liquid. I'm starting with about 3/4 of a cup, but we'll see how thick or thin this is when it's blitzed up, and if it's too thick, we'll add a little more. And then we give this a really thorough blend to make sure it's as smooth as possible. Now this isn't looking too bad, but it is a bit thick, so I'm adding another generous splash of the fermentation liquid and giving it another whiz. The final step is to cook out the sauce. This helps to mellow and blend all of the flavors together and make sure the final sauce has a nice smooth consistency. I'm going to bring this to a boil and let it simmer gently for about 10 minutes, stirring occasionally. Once that's cooked and has had a chance to cool down a bit, I'm going to give it one last blitz just to make sure it's really smooth. I find I get best results doing this in a tall, narrow container, but I don't have one big enough to hold all of the sauce, so I'm doing this in 2 separate batches. I am adding a couple of extra ingredients at this point, so lastly I'll combine the 2 batches and blitz them one last time together, just to make sure that the whole batch of sauce is consistent. So 1 tablespoon of fish sauce and 1/8 of a teaspoon of xanthan gum into this batch, whizzing that up until it's nice and smooth, and then pouring that into a large jug. The same with batch 2, which is a little bit smaller, but that's why I'm blending them together at the end to make sure that the whole batch is consistent. So the rest of the fish sauce, the rest of the xanthan gum, blending it until smooth, and then adding that to the jug. And then just one final blitz to get it nice and consistent and homogeneous and smooth. I like to add the fish sauce after cooking because I feel like the cooking process boils off some of the delicate flavors and aromas. The xanthan gum is optional. It does a really good job of making sure that the sauce continues to have a smooth consistency over time. Without this, you may find that the solids and the liquids in the sauce may eventually start to separate into 2 separate layers. I'm using a funnel to pour it into some clean bottles, which I'm going to store in the refrigerator. Because of the acid from the fermentation and from the vinegar, this should keep really well in the refrigerator for up to 6 months. If you'd like to keep this sauce for longer, you can use sterilized bottles and then put them through a canning process, but for me, this stuff is so delicious it's not going to last that long. And yes, the acid from the vinegar and the cooking process has completely destroyed all of the wonderful beneficial bacteria that we've built up during the fermentation process, but this sauce is fermented for flavor. If you're interested in the health benefits from eating food with naturally beneficial bacteria, you might want to follow this link to check out my sauerkraut video, another really easy and tasty fermentation project for beginners. Stay spicy, and until next time, happy snacking.